Edward Goldberg teaches at New York University's Center for Global Affairs and is the author of the recent book, The Joint Ventured Nation: Why America Needs a New Foreign Policy. Eddie and Peter, thank you for coming and welcome to the Exchange on Real Vision.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
So, a Pentagon report released in October found that U.S. manufacturing outsourcing over the last 40 years has created dozens of areas where there's huge vulnerability for the U.S. military. And the reliance on low-cost suppliers of critical materials, both manufactured and raw, particularly China, is outlined in this study, and it cites 10 so-called risk archetypes. And those include things like sole source and single source suppliers and providers, diminished U.S. manufacturing capability, gaps in U.S. human capital, U.S.-based infrastructure problems, and so forth. And the specific threats to the U.S. militaries range from rare earth minerals, of which the U.S. produced none in 2017, to flat screen displays for combat aircraft. And it's also pointed out that these same vulnerabilities exist for civilian industry. Further, there seems to be a mounting splintering effect going on. For example, a new study by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found that China had obscured the military backgrounds of a number of people who were attending technical and scientific colleges and universities in the Western world. Cornell University has recently become the first foreign university to halt a partnership with a Chinese counterpart, and that because of concerns over academic freedom. And finally, Chinese President Xi Jinping said recently that the Chinese Southern Theater Command, which is in charge of the South China Sea and Taiwan, should, quote, concentrate preparations for fighting a war. So there are a whole lot of indicators pointing in the same direction, and things are not looking good. Eddie, what happens to the global supply chains if, whether through geopolitical Cold War or actual hot war, trade in critical goods between China and the U.S., or more broadly between China and the West, is cut off?
Well, first of all, it will take 3 to 4 years to replace and have alternate manufacturing. It's not overnight. But I think we have to be very careful here. I think we all know about the Thucydides trap. The Graham Allison of Harvard wrote about basically a rising power threatens the established power, leads to war. He calls it the Thucydides trap because it started between Athens and Sparta. But we saw it before World War I with the UK and Germany. So we have to not rush ourselves into the Thucydides trap, which we might be doing.
Right. I think that is actually a very good observation, because we found that in the past that these connections between countries have actually decreased the likelihood of war. And the fact that there is a supply chain connection that has been so profound is something that has worked for a long time now to decrease tensions until very recently.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. And we're now saying, let's break those lines that make us interconnecting. And let's almost, on both sides, and tit for tat, I don't know who began the tit for tat. We could say Trump's tariffs might have begun it, or we could say the somewhat new Chinese policy away from Deng Xiaoping of China being a major foreign policy force in the world by the Chinese government has changed that. I don't know who changed it first, but it's problematic.
Well, the pivot to Asia goes all the way back to Obama.
Correct.
So, it's clearly that was right. An issue. Peter, you have thought a lot about these issues, and you coined this really interesting term, patriotic capitalism. What does that mean?
So patriotic capitalism is what I see arising from the devolution of the interconnectivity that you've talked about, which is, from the perspective of confidence, interconnectivity is a great manifestation of sort of that us everywhere forever mindset that goes along with peak confidence. So right. You have Friedman saying the world is flat.
Right.
And to me, that's sort of a peaking moment. And so part of that was the development of transnational corporations, companies that sat above these political states, trying to
Right.
operate in a frictionless global environment. As confidence declines, they're going to have to choose. So capitalism is going to become much more nationalistic, where corporations are going to have to figure out which side they sit on, recognizing that there are going to be clear consequences. That if the deterioration continues as it's being articulated, you are patriotic China or you are patriotic the United States.
Or patriotic Australia or patriotic Germany or whatever.
Does that mean also we're going to have an industrial policy? So the government says, you're not going to invest here, you're not going to invest there, and we're going to have a government industrial policy?
Sure, you're seeing it already. Right. I mean, you're watching capital flows in and out of Saudi Arabia. It, to me, is a very recent example of where policymakers are framing both the in and the out. And I think that the United States, particularly having outsourced so much supply, is going to start from sort of the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy.
Right.
Things that touch security-related issues are where you're going to see that issue first.
And so, Peter, looking back, when do you think confidence peaked, and why did it peak then, and why did it start to decline? So
I put the peaking, tops are not a V-shaped, inverted V-shaped moment. There's an arc that begins, from my perspective, in the late 1990s with the manifestation of the European Union and the Euro and the merging of military suppliers. There are lots of things that go along with that, including then the exporting of manufacturing in the United States. And I would say that the quintessential expression of that was Federal Express, and that notion that you could get anything from anywhere at once simultaneously. And you've started to see since then slow degradations, nothing, and that's very natural with overconfidence. Overconfidence has to be proven wrong. The Trump administration has really tried to enforce and to promote me here now rules, whether it's on the immigration front, foreign trade, tariffs, are all based in that reptilian brain.
Oh, I agree. And it's basically, it's definitively an anti-economic intellectual movement. And
I agree with you in that cognitively.
Yeah, that's what I mean. In cognitive, let's take David Ricardo's basic principle, which kind of is the principle that shaped world trade forever. You manufacture in the most efficient place. Where
the lowest cost place.
No, not necessarily the lowest cost, most efficient, where you make the most profit. Yeah. And so consequently, for instance, after England adopted this philosophy, after the Corn Laws were repealed, by 1880, England was no longer food self-sufficient, because it doesn't make sense to grow all this food in this rainy, horrible climate, import food, make steel and railroads, right? So, but now Trump is saying, David Ricardo's out. We're not going to produce economically around the world where it's most efficient, where we have an integrated supply chain, which is efficient. We're going back to this nationalist, almost 1914 worldview.
And it's very, those things that are far away, when we don't have confidence, equals fear.
Right, exactly.
And so it's clearly, and you've seen it on the energy front. I think, behind the scenes, what's happened with fracking and American self-sustainability from an energy perspective is the beginning of this trend.
So does the tail wag the dog? I mean, it's a chicken and egg question. What does the trend predate is Trump a manifestation? I think we're agreeing that he is of a deeper underlying trend. So that trend, fracking was a scientific paradigm shift, and it was not predicted that would result in what it did. It did do that. That has affected U.S. foreign policy, U.S. attitude towards the Middle East, all sorts of things, and it certainly set the stage for what would arguably be a confidence-building thing. We now have our own energy, but that has not been the way it's turned out.
No, and again, that overlay of mood being negative, none of these are the victories that you would have anticipated. And what they represent to me is a hunkering down, a turn inward, where we must be self-sustaining because everything around us is something that we should be fearful of.
And because change is happening so quickly.
And change.
Fear of change. I mean, think about it. It's not that the jobs really haven't been shipped to China in the last 10 years, per se. Some have, but in general, that is old news. What's new news is automation. You have, for instance, Trump talks about steel tariffs. 1970, it took 10 people to make a ton of steel. Today, it takes one. Those jobs didn't go to China. They went to machines.
And it's striking that you would have this level of fear with a almost record low level of unemployment.
Right. Yes.
It's counterintuitive.
Yeah. Right. In fear of immigration with basically no unemployment.
So that's one of the big, philosophical debates is what we're seeing, the rising fracturing, populism, all those things globally, not just in the U.S., are they really a result of economic dislocation, or is there some other set of factors that's at play? And you have people with strong opinions on both sides. Where do you fall on that?
So I think that there is, we came together in a global community where the result was that those who were not embracing of that global movement, who are fearful of what it means to their tribe, and tribe being, depends on where you are, but a very, localist identity. And so now you're seeing the backlash where, small communities are rising up and saying, we have to protect ourselves. They are dangerous, whether they are immigrants into Europe, manufacturers from China. It's definitely a us and them. It's not only capital being viewed on a national basis, but even you have partisan capitalism developing as well, and who is going to be on one side versus the other.
Right. Well, and the urban-rural divide actually plays into this quite significantly. I think because, and that's such an interesting topic, because the things that allow you to succeed and thrive and even survive in an urban environment and in a rural environment are very different. And so, proceeding from an urban environment, you never know who you're going to run into. You have to be open. You have to have you have to expect diversity. In a rural environment, it's much more closed. It's much fewer people that you make contact with, and so it just builds an entire different psychological profile living in those places, and that, it seems to me, has been distilled into this almost social cognitive dissonance that we're experiencing.
Without a doubt. And Krugman pointed out, in his Nobel paper about the building of clusters. And New York's a cluster, the Bay Area's a cluster, London's a cluster. And they're just huge vacuum cleaners sucking the best and brightest from the rural areas.
But I would be careful in making this entirely a geographic divide, because when I look at confidence, there are any number of divisions that transcend geography. So the confidence divide that arises from education, those with, those without. Right. There's a clear confidence divide in terms of women. Those who are confident and forward-looking, embracing, versus right. those who aspire back to a more 1950s version. And so I think that we're, in trying to create clear divisions, one of the things that I'm noticing is that as this is evolving, it's creating awkward choices for people. So you can't, a more liberal educated woman in a rural environment is struggling to find an identity in that space. So it's not, I caution against using a really broad paintbrush here, because the sides haven't yet formed.
No,
it's
I think
multivalent.
that's a good point, yes.
Yeah.
It's very multivalent, lots of different
Right.
inputs.
Yeah.
But all of them feeding into this fracturing.
Yes, and ultimately, people will have to choose a side, because the disparity of objectives is widening. Can you toss into this a uniting leader? And sadly, as mood is falling, they are ineffective. That we naturally divide, and not just left and right. I think what was most telling to me at the bottom of the Greek crisis was that the divisions among voters was almost a kiddie pool. There was nothing in the middle. Everybody went to somewhere on the outside. And so it speaks to your point about, what if we brought in a unifying leader? It's like, no, this is sort of a Serengeti scattering of the herd.
Well, and the interesting thing is that it's global. And I think, we tend to think, well, this is we have this big country and we have this problem of, disunity and social decohesion and all. But that, as you just mentioned, Greece, it is a global issue. In one way or another, it is happening in a substantial amount of the globe.
Without a doubt. Look what happened to the German leadership.
Yeah, exactly. And so, if that's true, then there's some underlying cause set of causes that's global. And what is that? Is it change? Is it technology? Is it a certain kind of? Is it hyperconnectivity technology? What's behind something that's manifesting itself in so many culturally divergent places?
I struggle to say this is the one thing, but I think that there is a unifying cycle of confidence that is global in nature. And so you see these large global cycles over history, and this is one that I think, because of our interconnectivity, we are all moving in unison. That the tribe is a global tribe, not a European tribe, not an American tribe, but we have become one. Some of it fostered through technology, some of it through transportation. All of those extending yourself out vehicles have been used.
Right. So let's talk for just a moment. Let's talk about a dystopian scenario where some event or set of events sharply curtails trade and the supply chain between, let's say, China and the West.
The U.S. is probably the lucky country, as always. We've been very much a lucky country. Geography, we're the lucky country. In terms of manufacturing, I think soon, according to McKinsey, we're going to be the, again, #1 manufacturing company in the world. That's all going to be robotic, but it's going to be there. So I don't think, it's going to be more costly to us. We're not going to have, we're not going to have jeans at $100, at $60 a pair. They'll be $178 a pair till that gets worked out through the system. But I think the U.S. is the place that has least to fear in all of this.
Do you think that informs the Trump administration's aggression?
Yeah, I think the Trump administration really thinks that our economy, just forgetting about least to fear, our economy now is running on, all cylinders. The Chinese economy is perceived to be weak. We can be as aggressive as possible. I think in terms of history, it's horrible. There was the Trump administration said a couple of weeks ago, we won't talk to the Chinese until they come up with some concessions. Well, if you're talking about a Chinese historical mind, that's what the British said before, with the Opium War. This is people that have a long, proud history. That's not how you negotiate.
No, and are it's very top of mind that they've had 150 years of subjugation.
Correct.
And they
exactly.
will cite that.
Correct that. So you don't say bring concessions first.
Yeah, and of course that's also the neoconservative mindset that Reagan broke with to deal with the, to actually change things with the Soviet Union, because they were always saying, well, we're not going to talk to them until they do what we want.
Correct.
And of course then they never did.
Right.
And so it took somebody who would step outside that to talk to them and get them to do
exactly.
what we want, So Peter, what's your view on what happens? What does China look like in that scenario?
Well, let me address what the U.S. looks like, because I think that when that shift occurs, there will be a clear prioritization of national security objectives over rights and issues related to the consumer. So the economic focus becomes one of the consumer sacrificing in exchange for industrial production, manufacturing that supports a military security related domain. I think that associated with that becomes stockpiling and lots of redundancy. So you start to see businesses on behalf of the government put in the position of inventorying and ensuring that there are whatever primary, secondary, tertiary supplies are physically placed here in the United States, again, to the sacrifice of whatever the consumer might have wanted.
Right, yeah. And what does that do to prices?
So, to me, the aspect of this is that what causes this environment is an environment of low confidence, fearfulness, which likely is already associated with an economic downturn. So I'm actually not worried about inflation as a result of this. If anything, it's probably a counterforce to what otherwise would be deflationary forces.
Right.
But I think that the issue will be that there will be no demand and no supply forthcoming on the part of for the consumer.
Right. And so now, what are you? I'd like both of you to tell me what you think China looks like under this scenario.
So I think that China quickly retreats from its, quasi-private capital model, and that you are forced back into a very, heavy authoritarian environment,
Which they're already on the track to anyway.
and goes along with, low confidence.
And I totally agree. And in fact, it's almost, we would be doing that also.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course the other question is what happens in the environs of China with all the countries where there's little love lost between China and its neighbors, and does China become militarily more aggressive? And that's a classic strategy is when your country's under some kind of pressure, you mount a war to unify everybody.
Except in Chinese history, it's not. Chinese history, China, except for what it sees as the countries that pay the Middle Kingdom homage over the thousands and thousands of years, it's never been an aggressive empire. They have not been like Russia, for example. They're just not, now, doesn't mean they can't be, but it's not in their historical tradition.
Right. So what do you think that the global implications of this kind of process that we're involved in, and the decline in confidence, the splintering effect, whatever you want to call it, what is that going to do globally to markets? And what do investors think about? I mean, what should one prepare for, and what are the signals that something seriously might go wrong in that kind of situation?
So I think from a capital markets perspective, in that same mindset of stockpiling, my comments to business leaders has been, stop looking at your business on a consolidated basis and start to look at it again on a country by country basis. Assets, liabilities, do you have the ability to fund yourself and to run on a continuous basis in the instance where capital, labor, goods become hostage to controls of all kinds. And as you might imagine, that sort of generates a pretty laughable response.
Yeah. Oh, that can't happen.
That can't happen. And yet, I think that if you think about how these divisions take place, that is very much what's likely to happen.
Well, this is, the failure of imagination, I think, is what has caused so many of the mistakes that we've suffered from, is that people say, well, that can't happen. It can't happen here. It won't happen. And that's simply because people, they lack the imagination to.
And we have to, I agree with that. And at the same time, this very dark story we're painting, which is a very dark story, we have to say at the same time, running simultaneously, is the effect of AI and technology on the labor markets. Mm-hmm. And so, you're bringing all this, the governments in the scenarios now demanding non-consumer production, basically. But yet we're going to have a huge workforce with no jobs. Even if work comes back from China, it's going to be automation. And what are we going to do with these people? Just look at the driverless truck. The largest employer in most states in this country are Teamsters, truck drivers. In 10 years, they're not going to have a job. Less than 10 years, probably.
I'm far more cautious on the automation front. That notion of driverless vehicles, again, speaks to extreme confidence. And so it has been interesting to watch the changing tide in our feelings towards innovative technology. And I think that as confidence falls further, AI becomes something that we are much more suspicious and leery of. And particularly, to your point, if it means substituting a robot for a person.
Interesting.
That becomes a real threat.
Right.
Well, and this is actually, it's a very interesting issue to discuss regarding what's going on right now with social media. We may make a social decision that the implications and the results of social media are so deleterious and so corrosive to society that we move away from it.
And so privacy violating. So that fear that if I am out on social media, my government, a foreign government, now has the ability to profile me and to classify me. And that becomes a very worrisome issue in an environment of rising authoritarianism. So folks just opt out because they don't want to leave electronic footprints that would suggest, you are this person, therefore you go there.
Right, yeah. And that's actually the linkage between what is a rising authoritarianism globally and the suspicion. I hadn't thought about that. That's a fascinating link, actually. Hopefully you're right, and it's too negative. But we are living in a world in which China seems itself to have lost a huge amount of confidence. And if you just look at the titles that Xi Jinping gives himself,
right.
When he's the great this and the master of that, and so and Deng Xiaoping ran as the head of the Bridge Club or something. Right. He didn't need any titles because he was so confident in his own ability to master the situation. And so China turning the tide in this this new surveillance system they have that'll be in place by 2020. That's dystopia made real, and it's exactly what you're talking about. And so we're really at a turning point, I think. So what do you think the world looks like in 5 years?
I used to be in international business before I became in academia. Spent a lot of time in Europe. And even the European capitalists would tell me how capitalism runs America, right? But let's look example of Boeing. The Boeing as we know it, unless it all totally becomes a military contractor, cannot exist just for the US market. The company's just too big. Manufacturers, it's the first or second largest commercial manufacturer planes in the world. It sources from 5,000 different factories around the world. It partly sources from those factories because of the benefits of the international supply chain, and also sources for those factories because Japan, why should you bother to build a plane? We're using your parts.
Right.
These companies no longer have the power, we think, with this new concept we're talking about, with almost a national industrial policy based on the fact that the state now becomes much more important than globalization.
So one of the places where I am encouraged is watching youth today. So we've gone through this arc. I spend a lot of time looking at what kids read because nothing conveys mood. And so we've watched them go through Harry Potter to Twilight to the Hunger Games to now all of this really dystopian. And we view them as depressed and anxious. The good news in that is that anxiety is now turning into action. They are moving into motion. And so when you talk about 5 years from now, I expect to see a major shift where the young who are sick and tired of, what's going on around them say, enough. We are moving into to take charge. A real generational shift.
Now, I think that's a great way to close things out because I agree with you. It is full of hope, and I think that having grown up in a environment full of fear and of fracturing, they may want an alternative. They may want to turn it around, and that's sort of what the greatest generation did after World War II.
They are more optimistic about the future than they are the present.
Yeah, which is what you need.
Wonderful.
Which is
what you need, exactly.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, Eddie, Peter, thank you so much for being here.